Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Mosey, the Master of Selwyn. You're all very welcome here in the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium, or if you're joining us online, you're equally welcome. And today is a significant day for the college. It marks the moment when our commitment to an underexplored field of study feels most real, when we host a lecture by our visiting fellow in Indenture Studies. And we believe that Professor Gaiutra Bahadur is the first person in the world to hold such a role, and we owe it to the support of quite a number of people, reflected in the title that she is the Ramesh and Leela Narain Visiting Bi-Fellow. And we've also worked closely with the Amina Ghafoor Institute, whose director is our alumnus and honorary fellow David Dabadine, who's also here tonight, in setting up this program which allows a scholar to spend 8 weeks at the university conducting research, and the scheme will run for an initial 5 years. Now, the study of indentureship and its legacies was one of the recommendations made in the report on the legacies of enslavement by the Cambridge Advisory Group, and it's hoped that enough funding will be available to make this a permanent professorship in the subject based at the university. So if you'd like to support us, do please let us know. And we've been really delighted to have Professor Bahadur with us at Selwyn in recent weeks. She was educated at Yale and Columbia, and she was a fellow at Harvard, and her home base is now Rutgers University, Newark, and almost the same place. She is also an acclaimed writer and journalist, with her best-known book, Coolie Woman, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. Now, Gaiutra is going to speak to us for 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll then invite your questions. And if you're watching live at home, you can email those to me, master@sel.cam.ac.uk. That's master@sel.cam.ac.uk. But let us now hear from Professor Bahadur.
Thanks, Roger, for the kind introduction and the warm welcome at Selwyn for the past month. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's good to see new friends and some old ones as well who've been kind of part of the journey of Coolie Woman since its publication a decade ago and even before that. So coolie was the British bureaucratic term for indentured laborer. But you should know that today the word lands as a slur, even if a reclaimed one in the West Indies. My book is a narrative history of indentured women. And this evening I'd like to reflect on the difficult task of writing such a history when the figures at its center didn't leave behind many written traces of themselves. And I'd like to give this lecture in memory of my nani, my maternal grandmother. Writing Coolie Woman was, in many ways, an act of filial piety, and I see it as my duty to honor my nani by acknowledging her role in making it possible. Coolie Woman isn't about her, strictly. The book reconstructs and reimagines the journey of another ancestor, Sujaria, my great-grandmother on my father's side. She sailed from Calcutta to the Caribbean, indentured to a sugar plantation in British Guiana. When she left in 1903, she was 4 months pregnant. I know this because a century later, while trying to unravel her history, I found her emigration pass in Guyana's National Archives. In the left corner in pencil, someone had scribbled the note, "Pregnant 4 months." And I had known that my grandfather, Lal Bahadur, was born on a ship from India. I'd known the name of the ship, the Clyde, and the date of his birth. I'd even known that he was born legs first, because family lore had it that this strange debut had given him a healer's powers. But all else about Sujaria's journey was unknown to me at the time. The document allowed me to begin giving flesh to her story. Using the ship's landing date, my grandfather's birth date, and that note in pencil, I was able to figure out that he was born 2 months premature as well as legs first. It might seem like a minor detail, but for me, it raised important questions about the conditions of her journey. Down below in the hold of the ship where the indentured lived and slept and ate and died and gave birth. Single women in one section, single men in another, couples in the middle. Was her experience in that ship's belly so brutal that it induced labor 2 months early? Other texts on her emigration past raised questions about other potential traumas. Handwritten in ink, next to the typed line asking for bodily marks, were the words burnt mark, left foot. A mark on the colonial bureaucrat's century-old page pointed with disconcerting intimacy to a mark on her skin. I fixated on the burn mark. What did it mean? Was there an act of violence behind it? Did that potential act of violence explain why she had left India? I held the emigration pass in my hands for the first and last time in 2003, 5 years before Amitav Ghosh's Sea of Poppies was published, 5 years before his story of a widow, rescued quite dramatically from the fires of Sati, could exert any influence on my imagination. Still, the melodramatic possibility of my great-grandmother being rescued from her husband's funeral pyre did occur to me. Or could she have been burned somehow by recruiters who kidnapped her? Or could it have been something more mundane, a minor domestic accident, perhaps an errant flame while tending a chulha, the clay stove traditionally used to cook outdoors in rural India? The writing on the emigration pass gave me many details to work with to try to unlock the mystery behind Sujaria's exit from India. It told me the name of her village, her father, her next of kin. Next to the line reserved for name of husband, there was a pointed M dash, a provocation. Other blanks were filled in: her age, her height, her caste, the name of the plantation she was sent to on landing. You can see it there scrawled in red across the side of the emigration pass, and more. As with many of the written records I scrutinized in archives, mostly at the National Archives at Kew, the document revealed so much and at the same time, so little. The M dash next to husband's name confirmed what my father had revealed when I first asked about our connection to India. Though that was 25 years ago now, his words still echo. She was a pregnant woman traveling alone, he said. His grandmother Sujaria was our closest link to India, the last in our line to leave that distant motherland. She died before I was born, so I didn't know her. My father had helped care for her in her final years when he was a boy growing up in a village 2 miles from the last plantation where she had worked. I grew up in the same village, Cumberland. So did my nani, who passed away in New Jersey 3 years ago. Both sides of my family, the maternal and the paternal, were deeply rooted in that village, a half-hour's walk from the cane fields where they had worked for 5 generations. So hold on to that place for now. I will come back to the village. It's an important part of the story. First, I'd like to give you some key context about indenture and the role that gender played in shaping it. So indenture was the system of bonded labor instituted after emancipation in more than a dozen British colonies from the Indian Ocean to the West Indies, as well as in several French and Dutch colonies. Beginning in 1834, more than 2 million Indians were shipped across the globe to replace freed Africans on sugar and cocoa plantations, and also to build railways in East Africa, pick tea in Assam, and tap rubber in Malaysia. A smaller number of Chinese and Madeirans, altogether roughly 250,000, were also transported in that way. My ancestors were all part of this semi-coerced mass movement, which the canonical histories have described as a new form of slavery. Among the laborers taken from India to New Worlds, nearly a third were women. And of those women, 2/3, like Sujaria, were traveling without husbands by their sides. That M dash next to husband's name demarcated what we could know and what we couldn't know about hundreds of thousands of women, not just my great-grandmother. It was a sharp invitation to ask who they were, all of them, as well as to ask who Sujaria was. I began to see that our private family story, the enigma of her leaving India, was part of a broader public history waiting to be written. I wanted to produce a collective biography that revealed the critical place of Indian women within the history of Indian indenture. The women recruited to go included widows and sex workers. There were fugitives from poverty and gender-based violence. Some had run from husbands. Others had been cast out by them. Some were not escaping at all, but were kidnapped into indenture. To learn more about their motivations and circumstances, and to place my great-grandmother in this larger narrative, I began by turning to official archives. Empire's record keepers were prolific. As such, I had enough documents to work with to try to recreate the texture of indentured women's lives. I cataloged and analyzed hundreds of reports on the crossings of 80 ships over a decade, beginning 5 years before and ending 5 years after Sujaria sailed. I did the same with transcripts of investigations into plantation uprisings and mutinies and rapes during voyages from India. I read the text of colonial office dossiers on overseers who slept with Indian plantation workers, and India office inquiries into abuses by quote-unquote coolie recruiters in India's hinterlands. I learned quickly, however, that there are major gaps in the archives, and they're structural in nature. The way that power has been held or withheld has, of course, silenced certain people, born into the wrong class, race, or gender. A historian in Trinidad, Kusha Harit Singh, has spoken of our need to free ourselves from what he calls the tyranny of the text in recovering our histories. The text has been tyrannical. It was written by those in positions of power who obviously had a vested interest in telling the story from their own perspectives. The perspectives of the indentured are mostly missing. Since they were not, for the most part, literate, they didn't leave behind letters or diaries or many other written traces of themselves. Only 3 memoirs about indenture exist, and all were written by men. The tyranny in the records of indenture thus applies especially to women. If indentured men were forgotten by history, indentured women were even more so because they were even more powerless. The women did not write down their experiences in their own words, and I could read them only indirectly through the eyes of white men who sometimes took their testimonies. These were also white men who held power over them, the doctors aboard ships, plantation overseers, colonial officials, ship captains. The writing they generated about indentured women was one-sided and often full of racist and sexist judgments. On some level, this extensive paper trail provided evidence of the women's physical lives, but it did not, indeed it could not, reveal much about what they thought or felt. The interior lives of the women went undocumented, but their bodies did not. The archives are filled with descriptions of both their physical allure and the physical trauma they suffered. Because I couldn't read their words, I turned to photographs, both as a source and a storytelling device. I may not have had a pathway to their thoughts, but I could look at the faces of a few indentured women. This is thanks largely to the Caribbean tourist industry, which was taking hold at the same time that photographs and cameras were becoming widely accessible. In the 1880s, a European photographer with a studio in Port of Spain took dozens of photos of Indian women in Trinidad. Similar images were produced in Jamaica and British Guiana. They ended up on postcards that sold an image of the Caribbean as a tropical vacationer's paradise. And they form a visual archive that allows us to look at the women while they return our gazes. These Orientalist images, many of them captioned Coolie Belle, emphasize the women's clothes, their jewelry, their beauty. The reason for their presence in the Caribbean, that is, their labor on the plantations, was rarely even suggested. I found myself reading their bodies, their facial expressions, their poses, their gestures, for various signs of resistance. Eyes flashing with anger, a mocking smile, a defiant jut of the jaw. So here are a few of the postcard images. What I've done is juxtapose them with photos that come from private albums, mostly my own family's albums. These private images don't airbrush the setting. you see plantation barracks in the background. They portray humble lives, hardship, and poverty, even as they showcase the wealth of grandsons on laps and wives beside husbands. They're strikingly different in form and content from the postcard images. So Victorian-era newspaper accounts of violence against the women provided another unsatisfying way for me to read their bodies. I mentioned that women made up less than 30% of Indian plantation workers during indenture. Because they were scarce, they were sought after, sometimes taken by force and sometimes leveraged by both Indian and white men. Fathers extracted bride prices for their daughters, while plantation staff assigned or reassigned women to new husbands to punish or reward male workers. Sometimes the women themselves took advantage of their scarcity. They could choose one man over another, even trade up in relationships to men with more money or status in the plantation, or sometimes caste hierarchy. But this was not without consequences. Many women were attacked by the men they refused, with machetes meant to cut cane, instead claiming noses, ears, and arms. In colonies across the globe, hundreds of women were killed in this manner by their partners or would-be partners. In Guiana alone, between 1859 and 1917, when the last indenture vessel sailed, more than 167 women were killed. Newspaper articles and coroner's reports cataloged the victims' injuries in grim detail. The precise number of wounds, the inches they bit into a skull or cheekbone, the specific body parts chopped. I read every account of these domestic attacks that I could find in British Guyana's Daily Chronicle in 1903. Written on the women's bodies through incisions of the cutlass was the brutal story of colonial violence. Unlike the burn mark on my great-grandmother's foot, these were not mysterious intimations of trauma. They told a tale of blunt force, of disfigurement, dismemberment, and death. I knew that this victim or vixen's tale, as told by colonial officials, could not be the only story of indentured women's lives. Official sources are hardly godly, and I think one of the things creative nonfiction can do is question those sources to move the tectonic plates under them when it's right. There's a troublemaker strand of historiography that holds that the archive itself is a fiction. The fact that the testimonies of so many subaltern people are absent from the written record unsettles history's claims to objective truth. The problems of omission and bias in traditional archives, which inherently favor the lettered and the privileged, destabilize history as a genre. They open it up to ambiguity and contradiction, suspense and subjectivity, qualities more the terrain of the novel. Embracing these possibilities, I used experimental narrative strategies to maneuver past, to dramatize, and to interrogate the official archives of indenture. I don't mean that I questioned the records in a metaphorical sense. I mean it literally. Entire sections of the book unfold as questions, one relentlessly following the next. These questions do hard work, I hope. They help paint landscapes, advance the plot, convey a tone, an attitude. They convey my own attitude to the archives, which couldn't possibly be neutral, a hard thing for a journalist to say, because this history is, after all, mine. It's profoundly personal, and there's no way to disavow that. If indentured women didn't write their stories, then I would have to let the heirs of their history tell it. As the author of Coolie Woman, I'm both a product of the history I've written and a first-person character in it, woven into the story as its descendant. But when I say I had to let the heirs of this history tell it, I don't just mean me. I turned to alternative sources to recover the full range of indentured women's experiences and to imagine their values and sense of self. I built, for instance, on feminist readings of the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. It's appropriate to the hermeneutics of indenture because it's a story of exile and a tale of women tested and punished for perceived violations of sexual honor. I also wove North Indian folk songs songs of birth and death and marriage into the narrative. And I dug for and found some gold, first-hand accounts of leaving India, collected from the last living survivors of indenture in Fiji and Trinidad in the 1970s and the 1980s. Sadly, no similar oral histories were preserved in Guiana. I was, however, able to spend a few hours in New York talking with an elderly woman who had been born in plantation barracks during the indenture era. She hadn't been indentured herself, but she had directly experienced life on a sugar estate in the barracks where indentured workers lived. So that's what this slide is about. Maharaji Bahuri had an elaborate tattoo snaking up her left forearm, like this one. That's not her. I asked her what the tattoo meant, and she told me it was called Sita Ki Rasoi, or Sita's kitchen. According to Hindu epic tradition, Sita, the god Ram's wife, the heroine of the Ramayana, is the very embodiment of the perfect wife, chaste and dutiful. Sita's kitchen is the name of a shrine in northern India where Sita was supposed to have cooked her first meal for Ram. In India's heartland, no Hindu bride could cook for her in-laws until she was inked with this tattoo. It had crossed the seas with the indentured, and for generations, Indian women in the Caribbean continued to be inked with it when they married. I was completely taken with this tattoo, and I did a risky thing. I asked if its persistence could tell us something about the significance of family to indentured women and their children, and even their grandchildren. These women who in many cases had been wronged by the patriarchal institution of family, who had also seen that institution disrupted and transformed by indenture, continued to display a symbol of the devoted and duty-bound wife on their arms. The tattoo of Sita's kitchen, written on the body of a 96-year-old in New York, was as valid a source to me as the reports of immigration agents who denounced quote-unquote coolie women as women of immoral character, bad in India, and bound to be equally bad in Guiana. The photo on the American edition of my book is not of Sujaria. It's of another great-grandmother, Raghubansha, who was born on a ship from India to Guiana. She was never indentured, but her parents were. It's a striking image with the jhumkas, the bell-shaped earrings at the top of her earlobes, and her serious, almost stern gaze. This photograph was taken in the 1950s for a passport, her first ever. She wanted to cross a river and an international border to attend a wedding in Suriname. So she applied for the passport and took the photograph. I know this because my nani, the grandmother I've recently lost, told me. Raghubansha was her mother-in-law, and Nani made the dress that you see on the cover of my book. She sewed it, and she did the intricate needlework to give the collar ornate edges and the sleeves the flourish of flowers. This is my Nani, Mathurani Ramcharan, at 16 on her wedding day. She didn't go to school beyond the age of 11 because village customs and family expectations didn't allow it. But she was literate. Her words, the letters she wrote to her brother in London, for instance, could conceivably end up in an archive. Yet all I have to remember her by are the doilies she crocheted, the stories she told, and the songs she sang. She was born a British subject, 1935, the granddaughter of indentured Indians. So her repertoire included both Indian folk songs and Christian hymns such as Abide With Me. She also liked Land of Hope and Glory. The irony isn't lost on me that this patriotic British song lived on her lips. But that too is an inescapable part of our inheritance. We have complicated bonds with the structures that have oppressed us historically, such as the Crown Colony, such as the family. I could not have written Coolie Woman without the stories that my Nani and other matriarchs in my family shared. She remembered Sujaria, and her memories informed what I wrote. The two lived in the same village, the village I asked you to put to the side at the beginning of this lecture. I'm asking you to come back to it now, carrying the alternative archive I've just given you. The tattoo of Sita's kitchen is part of that archive. So is the photograph on my book cover, an image of a woman born on an indenture vessel, wearing a dress sewn by her daughter-in-law, a daughter-in-law who kept and passed on the photograph and the story behind it. The oral and material memory preserved in families capture a different reality than the official records, which mostly point to the traumatized and sexualized bodies of indentured women. While the archives at Kew and the British Library sketch a tale of patriarchal and plantation violence, the story the alternative archive tells across generations is one of repair and reconstruction. With the move from the plantation to the village, the institution of family was rebuilt from the ruins wrought by indenture. Its survival has been, for women especially, fraught. As Naipaul wrote, the Indian family in the West Indies both protects and imprisons. It certainly did both for my Nani, who was denied an education because she was a girl child and defined by her role as a wife and the mother of 8 children, 5 of whom died as babies. Her life was undeniably marked by trauma, but it was also marked by hope for future generations. It all comes down to this fierce, grief-informed bond. One generation bequeaths what it knows to the next, and the next owes it to the first to write it down. I have owed it to my mother and my grandmothers and their grandmothers to write this book. So I'd like to end by sharing 2 family photographs, or come close to the end anyway, and the passages from Coolie Woman that rely on them. This first is a photo of my family on the day we left our village, Cumberland, and I'll begin with a passage from the first chapter. On November 7th, 1981, my family left our village, which sits along a creek surrounded by sugarcane in a wet and muddy corner of South America. In the picture we took to mark the moment, we stand in the front yard of the house my grandfather built, the house I grew up in, a house raised on artificial wooden legs like all the rest. In the photo, everyone looks annoyed. My mother, in bell-bottoms, holding my baby sister, appears to pout. My father, in sideburns, his arms hanging over my mother's shoulder, looks cross. His eyebrows are knit. Mine are too. They counter the optimism of my kiskity-colored dress and matching ponytail holders, blinding balls of yellow. I wonder what was wrong. Why do we look so displeased? Was the sun in our eyes? Were there packages from neighbors intended for sons somewhere in America, waiting to be stuffed somehow into our suitcases? My grandmothers, neither headed for America just yet, seemed content enough. Maybe we weren't looking forward to the long journey ahead, over the Kanji Creek Bridge by car, across the fat, pulsing Berbice River by ferry, through geometric fields of cane to our country's capital, and then, finally, across ear-ringing skies on our first plane ride ever, a Guiana Airways flight to New York City. Into the house in the picture, electricity had just come. But there was no phone or indoor toilet. I was almost 7, old enough to have memories of Guiana, and young enough to be severed in 2 by the act of leaving it. Emigrating was like stepping into a magician's box. The sawing in half was just a trick. In time, limbs and coherence would be restored, and a whole intact self sent back into the audience. But at my age, I didn't know that. All I knew was that everything seemed to split apart. Time became twofold, divided into the era BA, or before America, and the one after it, after November 7th, 1981. Space was also sundered, torn slowly into 2 conflicting realms, inside and out. My memories of Guyana are almost all set outdoors. The houses there stand on stilts to avoid the flood underfoot. That kicks open underneath a concrete terrain known as the bottom house. There, curries are cooked and eaten, laundry washed and set to dry. There, life unfurls, exposed to the eyes of the lane, open to the comment of neighbors. And there, visits are paid. Hammocks rock back and forth, marking the absence of time, as hours pass in gaffing, a West Indian brand of aimless talk, encompassing everything and nothing at once. Our bottom house opened into the front yard, where we posed for our photo that last day. To the left stood our guinep tree, the scant sweet pulp of its fruit encased in a green shell. To the right stood our concrete temple, the size of a tool shed. It lay outside the frame of that final picture, but I remember it vividly. The mandir was honeycombed for ventilation and painted as blue as the clay gods within. It sat next to my grandmother's garden, where so many times zinnias tucked into our braids, sheets wrapped like saris around our waists, my cousin and I played at being brides. Okay. So this passage is from the final chapter, and this is a photograph of Sujaria. When Sujaria arrived at Rose Hall in 1906, the milk seller she would marry a dozen years later still lived on the plantation, although he was no longer indentured. Together at some unknown point, they moved from the plantation to Cumberland, one of the colony's oldest established villages. She and her milk seller settled on a plot adjoining the very one where generations later, my cousin and I would circle imagined fires in our improvised saris 7 times to become playtime wives. How they got the land is unknown. What is known is that Sujaria, a paid childminder on the plantation, became an unpaid milk seller's wife in the village. Every morning she boiled a pot of fresh cow's milk and went door to door, peddling. Every evening she boiled the milk and set it to curdle in chamber pots, repurposed to make yogurt for sale. Her husband was a hard, ambitious man, a moneylender as well as a milk seller. One granddaughter distinctly remembers how once he thrashed a constable who tried to impound his cows. She recalls his violence towards Sujaria as well. He used to take a danta, a big walking stick, and maul her behind. He used to beat her bad. The sole photograph of Sujaria that survives is a family portrait, taken 3 decades after her arrival in Guiana. She sits on a chair in front of a rough-hewn house, an urnie properly draped over her silver hair, bangles stretching up her arms, her collar covering her throat, her brow high and proud. She looks every bit the matriarch, with a grandson cradled expertly on her lap and another by her side, clutching her sari. Although thin and taut, a centerpiece of composure and respect, Sujaria doesn't look severe. The corners of her mouth hint ever so slightly at a mother's satisfaction. Flanking her, her son born at sea and her daughter born in Guyana both rest a hand on her shoulder. Having likely relinquished parents, siblings, children, and possibly a husband in India, Sujaria succeeded in recreating family in Guyana. She instilled in her son and her son's sons a sense of duty to family religious in its fervor and commitment. They labored as a unit, with children working too, because they had to feed each hungering body and also each starving sense of self, to eke out peasant existences away from the exploitation and indignity of the plantation, in villages where they might nourish themselves with institutions remembered from India and seek the consolations of religion, kin, and identity. This feat of survival and in slow time progress was not without costs. When she endured her husband's beatings and his silencing cries of chup, his attempts to control her charisma and sparking will, perhaps she contemplated the tattooed reminder of Sita's devotion on her arm. Did she ever doubt whether it was worth it to suffer dutifully like that remote goddess, to preserve family in a form of self-sacrifice? Much as I had as an immigrant child, Sujaria had to tread between inside and outside. She had receded from the public sphere of the plantation to the more private sphere of the home and the village. Each delivered its own set of licks, and each required its own brand of forbearance. As much as religion or culture, imperial policy had nudged her inside. For this, too, had been a disfigurement of indenture, the complicity of women in their own fates, the tortured attachment, the tenderness they felt and continue to feel in the cave of their hearts for their own men, who had also been disfigured by planters and the colonial state. So I'd like to end with thanks and some more filial piety, I guess. It truly is an honor to be the inaugural fellow in the study of indenture at Selwyn. I'd like to thank Roger Mosey, Mike Nicholson, and all the fellows of the college for giving the field the attention and support that it deserves. Also Vicki Crook, who hasn't been here but has attended to all my needs very graciously and kindly. So I'd like to thank, of course, Dr. Niven Narain for his generosity in funding the fellowship, named in honor of his parents, Ramesh and Leela Narain. I owe a profound debt to the writers and scholars who have devoted their lives and careers to capturing the struggles and reinventions of our common ancestors who crossed the seas. We've lost two of these intellectual elders recently, Professor Brinsley Samaru of Trinidad and Professor Bridge Lal of Fiji. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge their committed, elegant, and path-breaking contributions to the histories of indenture. When I started my own research, their work provided an invaluable compass, as did the innovations of Guyanese historian Clem Seachurin and a group of Caribbean feminist scholars, including Pat Mohammed, Peggy Mohan, and Vereen Shepard. It's a truism that indenture is an overlooked epilogue to the annals of transatlantic slavery. If the history has been forgotten, it's not because gifted thinkers and artists haven't been hard at work for quite some time, excavating it and creating its enduring literature. And the driving force behind this fellowship is one of these giants, poet and novelist David Dabadine, an emeritus professor at Warwick, and an alum and honorary fellow of Selwyn, who's here with us this evening. So, David, thank you for the many anthologies about indenture you've edited, the primary sources you've recovered and published, and the fiction you've spun from the raw material of our history. Thank you for the Counting House and the Diary of Theophilus Richmond and all your foundational intellectual work. And thank you, of course, for your vision for the fellowship. We're all grateful to you for your tireless efforts to build academic homes for the study of indentureship and its legacies through a journal bearing that name and through the Amina Ghafoor Institute. I must also acknowledge the Guyanese philanthropists Amina and Satur Ghafoor for establishing the Institute, which is working closely with Selwyn to sustain the fellowships in the study of indenture. Amina Ghafoor is the founder and editor of one of the Caribbean's leading literary and cultural publications, the Arts Journal. Her many achievements include a bibliography of writing in English by and about Indians in Guiana, and the memoir A Lantern in the Wind, partly about her indentured forebears. A few Ghafoor Institute board members are present tonight. Thanks to Arlen Harris, Indira Payne, and Eve Kunram for coming up from London for the talk. Thanks also to Shalima Mohammed and Dr. Kumar Mohabir of the Indian Cultural Center in Trinidad, who also traveled from London to be here. And Dr. Mohabir, I think you know that the voices in your beautiful book, The Still Cry, were an inspiration for me in writing Coolie Woman. So thank you for being here and thank you for your work. Thanks also to my own friends who came out to support, repping Brooklyn and Brick Lane, Brixton and New Haven, New Delhi and Cambridge. You know who you are. Gratitude. So I've been talking about revered elders, but this fellowship is also about the next generation. David and Amina have had the foresight and generosity to create structures to help the ones who will take up the intellectual task in the years ahead. When I moved to London to begin my research, 15 years ago, there was little support, moral or financial, to write about indenture. I'm thrilled that this opportunity now exists for others. So much work remains to be done on caste in post-indenture societies, to offer just one example. I've done my part. I'm solidly in the middle of this intergenerational telling of the tale between the elders and a newer crop of researchers and writers. Indenture as a system also occupies the middle. It sits in an uneasy borderland between freedom and slavery. I've been arguing that indenture is an inheritance. That's a key part of its definition. We're still grappling with exactly what kind of an inheritance it is, one of harm or of hope. Was it sheer brutal exploitation like its predecessor, or was it in some crucial ways ultimately liberating? I think the elusiveness of easy answers explains in part why it's a forgotten history. It's too complex to be easily apprehended and straightforwardly taught. There's also the question of shame. shame for Britain because abolition was a virtuous denouement, and indenture represents a kind of inglorious revival. And shame for those who lived it and those who inherited it. Even when indentured women talked to their children and grandchildren about leaving India, there was a reluctance to share the complete story of what had happened to them. The stories that survivors tell can be as full of gaps and silences as the archives, and the shame gets passed down and takes new shapes. I'm reminded of a line from David Dabadine's novel, The Intended, where his young protagonist is riding the tube with his mates, all brown, all suffering the self-hate of being brown in a racist society, and suffering it with the aggressive vulnerability perhaps particular to adolescent boys. David writes, "In the swift journey between Tooting Bec and Balham, we relived the passages from India to the Caribbean to Britain, the long journeys of a previous century across unknown seas to the shame of plantation labor." Inherited shame is partly why indenture is a forgotten history, and it's also partly why it shouldn't be forgotten. We're still very much living in the afterlife of indenture, and descendants still contend with its painful legacies. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. And I'll stop there on the note that it's astute and right that the fellowship also supports the study of indenture's legacies.
Gaiutra, that was powerful and also extremely moving. Before we do get questions from the audience, I just want to ask one very general question about history, because we've talked about forgotten or repressed history. Are you confident this history will become bigger and we can tell those stories?
Yes, I am very confident because I know so many people at work on unlocking the different parts of it. I mentioned caste and the transformations of caste through the system as one example. I think land is another example, access to land, which is so central to debates about slavery and its legacies. When the indentured left India, they were promised a return passage. And in the colonies, sometimes that got changed to, okay, return passage or land. And so some people did benefit from that. It's not an area that has been examined enough, I think. So there's so much work left to do and so many scholars, artists, writers at work trying to unlock those untold parts of it.
Okay, let's go to questions from the audience. There is a microphone there which we will throw at you, and you can then be heard on YouTube and various other. So just signal if you'd like to ask a question, please. Somebody's got to ask the first question. Okay, gentleman there in the black top. Do you want to get... That's quite a way for Susanna to throw, but see how far we get. Not too good. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah, good.
Okay.
Just speak into it.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Bahadur, for your wonderful talk and your outstanding book. It's been widely referenced and people talk about it, and people who I know are into indentureship and post-indentureship studies are always recommending that they read the book. Shalima and I have come all the way from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean to see you and to listen to you.
Wow.
And,
no pressure.
So we've come a long way. I've come courtesy the Eccles Fellowship at the British Library.
Wonderful.
So it's the right timing. And we are accompanied by Shobi Ali, who was born in Guiana and left Guiana as a child and has taken up residence in England. My question to you is, you have written such a fantastic book. Do you have plans to make it into a documentary film or perhaps a movie?
It was optioned for a while, actually, by a film company based in Singapore. But as you know, with options, sometimes they come to nothing. And I've had a few queries about documentaries as well. But it's such a complex book, and although I've focused on my great-grandmother, she's the center of the book, there's so many different characters. I feel like it's hard to turn it into definitely a feature film. It's a challenge artistically, I think. But I'm certainly interested if anyone else is.
Anybody watching, get in touch on options. Yeah, I saw more hands over there. Gentleman behind, yeah.
Thanks ever so much for an excellent talk, Gaiutra. I think you said that indentured labourers came from India, China, and I think you said Madeira. Have your researchers come across any indentured labourers from European countries? I have a personal interest. I'm the great-great-grandson of an indentured labourer that went to Jamaica, originally from Germany. Sadly, I have absolutely no idea why he left or had to leave Germany to go to Jamaica. But I do know that at the end of indentureship, he got some land, and he'd originally trained as a metal worker in Germany, and he could then set up a gunsmith business, and then through, like you, I guess in your family, each generation worked hard and built on the efforts of previous ones.
Yeah, fascinating. When was that?
He left in about the end of slavery, about the 1830s. One of my distant cousins is quite interested and has researched that in Jamaica. And apparently the German indentured labourers were mainly a disaster. At the end of their indentureship, they ended up on the streets of Kingston begging, many of them.
So this was a mass movement, or there were many German indentured
Well, I think
immigrants?
there were a number. I'm not sure how many.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about that particular movement. I do know that there were Irish indentured laborers in the Caribbean in an earlier era. It was mostly 17th century.
Right.
So they're known in Barbados as the Redlegs, and so Rihanna is apparently descended from a redleg. And so there has been a lot written, I know, about Irish indentured laborers in the Caribbean.
Okay,
Sorry,
more questions. I think we're going to have to try and get the microphone right down to the front row.
Absolutely no way I can throw it that
straight
far.
towards Tissat over there, and he will try and...
Heads.
Not too bad.
Lovely, thank you.
Yes, a gentleman with a red and blue tie there. Just there we go. Yeah.
Good evening, and thank you very much indeed for a wonderful talk. Firstly, apologies that the traffic wasn't in my favour, so my apologies for being a few minutes late. My name is Peter Ramreka, and I was delighted to hear of the appointment and the vision that you have. As we tried to peel the onion to see the different aspects of indentureship and how we recycled ourselves, I was alerted to the fact that the Windrush generation, this is the 75th anniversary of the Windrush generation, and many of us who are regarded as part of the Windrush generation felt that perhaps the Asian contribution, in particular in the armed services, wasn't well recognized. And I had a look at information which was sent to me in 1944, from 1944 and 1945. In Guiana, or British Guiana, there were 420 soldiers who were coming voluntarily of Asian background, Chinese and Indians. And of those, when I looked through the list, about 82 were from Indo or Asian, let's use the term Asian because it embraces the Chinese. And I wondered whether your research will look into that aspect, whether there is time, Certainly, from the information which I have, it's available. So, I look forward to a dialogue at some point. Thank you.
Yes, well, the Amina Ghafour Institute is on it, right? So David has actually co-edited an anthology with Maria Calladine called The Other Windrush, which tells the stories of Asian Britons who came in that time period as part of that movement. And Maria Calladine, I mentioned that I'm optimistic because there's so many people hard at work on uncovering this history and various aspects of it, and Maria Calladine is one of them. I could throw out so many names of great scholars and artists and writers doing this work. So The Other Windrush.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, we'll stick on the front row here. So, brilliant.
Yeah, I do want to first follow up on the gentleman's question about, sometimes Asian population are not indentured workers are not considered as Creole community. So I wonder that through your research, how you see that how well that the Indian indentured community integrate within the local communities when they take root on the island. I mean, well, is there a lot of interracial mixture with Black and Creole communities, or Indian community exists more as a segregated community preserving their own cultural tradition, like the marriage tradition you mentioned? And another question is about just very shortly, how because you talk about the alternative archives. So because there are a lot of novels on Indian indentured community, do you think that novels of fictional quality can be a legitimate source for as an alternative archive?
Yes, those are both great questions. Thank you very much. To answer the first, it depends. It depends on the society that they immigrated to, the particular colony. Each has a different history on the question of intermarriage and assimilation. So, for instance, the story in Jamaica is different from the story in Trinidad, is different from the story in British Guiana. So the Guyanese context, which is the one I'm most familiar with, is hard on the question of race. And my current project looks at that in particular. It's a story about divide and decolonize, really, during the Cold War. But so roughly 50% of Indians were still living on plantations in 1950 in Guiana. And that meant that they were physically segregated from the African population, which was mostly based in the city, in cities, Georgetown mainly. So there wasn't a whole lot of interaction. I mean, there was, but not at the scale that would allow for greater intermarriage rates, for instance. Whereas in Jamaica, where the Indian population is relatively small, there was much more intermarriage. And I mean, this is such a complex question. Though I've talked about Coolie as a reclaimed word, there's another reclaimed word, Dagla, which comes from the Bhojpuri, the North Indian language. It's a term for someone of mixed caste, but in the Caribbean, it's understood to mean sort of bastard. And it's the word used to describe the children of Indians and Africans, right? So it's a stigmatized community. It's a growing community. And it's one that is reclaiming its history and poetics and identity. So the short answer is it varies depending on the particular politics and development of the colony that they went to. And the second question, absolutely. I mean, I studied in English literature as an undergraduate. I think of myself as a literary person, and I see literature as an expression of the values of a community. I mean, I mentioned The Counting House by David Dabadine, which is about the relationship between an Indian woman and an African woman on a plantation in Guiana. I mean, I use that as a source. I turn to lots of novels to get a sense of what that relationship was like, right?
Thank you so much.
We probably time for 2 more questions because time is flying. It's going to be right at the back now, so we need to get to the.
Slowly.
Right. almost took out the president of Clare Hall. Yeah.
That was heroic. I'm very impressed. Thank you for such an interesting and really profoundly moving talk. And I'm interested, particularly that you said one of the areas that does need more study is how caste is practiced among indentured people, because that's sort of what my question was about. And those are parts of the book that I found incredibly interesting as well. Brahmin men removing their sacred thread before getting on the ships, for example. You had a story in your book about a woman who returned to India and was going to a priest to do the ceremony to restore caste after crossing the Kala Pani, the black water. And my question was, do you know of people who tried to do similar ceremonies while they were in the Caribbean, or while they were in colonies as well? I'm just curious about how that particular caste practice might have continued or might have been expressed. But I realize that might be a very niche question.
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer to it. There might be people in the audience who do, but I'm not familiar with similar ceremonies in the Caribbean itself. I talked about, the framework for indenture and indentured women's stories is, is it escape or is it kidnap? Is it freedom or is it slavery? Is it something in between? And caste is, of course, key to that conversation because I think, caste was put to the side to an extent because of this migration. It's one of the oppressive structures from the subcontinent that was disrupted. And it's very complex how that works. I can't say that caste was overthrown because of the Kalapani and resettlement. And that's why more work needs to be done in that area. There are scholars doing it. Priya Prasad is someone who springs to mind. She's looking at caste. She's a scholar of religion, in case that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Time for one last question. Who's going to... In that case, we won't have a last question because we are almost at time. But Gaiutra, thank you so much for, as I say, a lecture which was, I think, inspirational and moving, shocking at times, but also revealing of history that we don't know enough about. And you have been a wonderful visiting Bi Fellow to launch this programme, so thanks so much for that.
My pleasure. Yes. Thank you.
I'm also going to embarrass, because he's been mentioned a number of times tonight, I'm going to embarrass David Daviddine by just asking David if you could just signal where you are. There. Absolutely. And David, thank you for being a great alumnus and honorary fellow of Selwyn and for really being the inspiration behind this programme. And I think we'd agree this is going to keep going.
Well, as long as I'm around.
Yeah, so
a measure of the integration of Indians in the Caribbean is the descendants of at least 4 West Indian cricket captains.
Well, David will make sure we keep going on this, and I think it's both something that Selwyn is now absolutely committed to, and we hope the university will live up to its pledges as well. I'm going to end, actually, on a rather commercial note by saying that if you have been so interested in the book that you'd like to buy it, you can do it, especially discounted price of £10, and I dare say you might sign it as well. So Gaiutra will be outside signing books in a moment or two. Thank you all for coming. Thank everyone online, and Gaiutra, thanks very much again. Thanks, everybody.